Hi Nick, we're live.
What's up, team?
Yeah, so today's episode is episode 2 of our 10 or 12 part series. We haven't decided yet, but it's gonna cover basic poker play for basically newer players. How would you describe what our series is about, Nick?
Beginner players looking to gather a pretty strong framework for how the game works. I would say that's a good start.
I would say that this is the series that would allow you to win your friends in poker for the rest of your life. You can't be a professional, but you can win all of your friends after this series.
This is also the series that would allow you to walk into a casino for the first time without being super terrified.
Yeah. After this series, you'll probably beat the smallest game in the casino in most American cities, like a 1-2 or 1-3 game.
That's the
So
goal.
that's
Get them beating 50-cent dollar in their local casino. All right, so
Yeah.
why don't you kick this off? We want to talk about pre-flop today. Why don't you lead us in with the simplest beginning framework for solid pre-flop play?
So I think the most important concept to understand about pre-flop play is position. When you're in different positions at the table, you have to play a different range. If you're out of position, you have to play tighter. If you're in position, you are allowed to play looser. So if everybody is playing well and perfect, the button always plays looser than early position, especially when it's folded to you, because positional advantage is something that increases your expected value in the game. And without going into too much details, and trust me, we'll cover this in a later episode, but for now, the premise that I need you to buy into, and it is definitely true, is that if we take professionals or we take recreational players and we had a big database of infinite information, the button is the position that in the long run you win the most from in poker, in the game of poker. And on average, a perfect robot would play the loosest on the button and then tighten up their range as they go into the other positions. So after the button, there's the cutoff and the hijack. It depends on how many players you have in the game. So basically, late position would be cutoff and button. And then there's middle position. And then there's the early position. The first to act is caught under the gun, and that player has to play the tightest. So, yeah, maybe it's your turn.
Sure. Well, first, I think it's cool that we do have solver software that shows that when the game is played perfectly, in order, it goes around from the button, playing the widest to the cutoff, the second widest, middle position, the third widest. That proves to us that there is something structural about the button that allows it to play wider. And then that I think is cool. So that's proven. Just want to throw in an analogy because it just came to me and I like using analogies for this stuff. We said we're not going to really go into depth as to why the button has the advantage. It does. But I want you to think about it in terms of a battle, like a war. Anytime there's a battle going on, in the history of all the battles, the army that is on higher ground usually has advantage in that battle. Being on the button is similar to having higher ground in a battle. Something about it. Just try to feel into how much harder it is to invade an army that has a higher ground advantage over you. So if that helps, there's probably a bunch of analogies that we could use for that, but I like that one because it's intuitive. So the button is a literal positional advantage. And if you want to think about that as having a height advantage or whatever, go for it.
Yeah, I would say there are two kinds of games in general. There's the kind of game where you're racing towards a certain score, and in those games, the first player usually has an advantage. But then there's another kind of game, and poker fits into this category, where it's the opposite of that. Going second just has an advantage. And we will go more in depth into the reasons why, but let's not get too caught up on that, and let's actually give you some practical insights about how you can use the knowledge that you should be playing tighter in the late positions to actually add that into your game. Because I understand that when you first start playing poker, you start getting cards. If you are playing a live game of poker, you get 2 cards. If you're playing online, you receive 2 cards on the screen, and you want to know what to do. That's the first step in poker. And here we are, like the most logical step in our explanation is to explain to you what to do in each position. So here's what we'll do, right? I would say that in a lot of positions, we can approximate a few positions into one, just so that you don't have to remember so many charts. And we are going to give you charts along with these videos. So I would say that at the minimum, we should start explaining how wide the button plays and then the cutoff, and then maybe we can chunk down middle and early position into like 1 or 2 categories. So
I like the idea of combining them because, I mean, the general thing that a new player has to take away is that I am going to be tightening up as I approach the button. So as long as you're doing it on some sort of gradient, you're in the right direction. We may think about button percentages in different filters. So why don't you give your explanation of, I think it was, you use something like how many hands I should play on the button, or what should my button voluntary play percentage be?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I would view it more in terms of, if it folds around to me, I should be raising at least half of the hands that are dealt to me on the button. That's sort of a benchmark for me. You can talk about it in two different ways. I'm sure there's even more depending on what different filter you want to use. But in general, how would you approach giving a player a starting range for opening on the button, or how would you approach that in general?
I'd say that the model that I'll use is the same as yours, raise first in. So first we assume that it's the simplest possible game where everybody has voted to you. So in effect, it's pretty much the same as if you're playing a 3-player game and you're on the button and there's a small blind and a big blind. So how wide would you play there? I think you and me are probably pretty similar. We play a looser range for the most part. Like you mentioned, at least half. I would say that that's probably not something that we can recommend to play, because it's a lot easier to play a tighter range than a looser range. Mainly because if you play a looser range, you might potentially make mistakes. You get into more marginal spots, and it's not a resilient strategy. So I would actually recommend the button to play something around 30 to 35% instead of the 50% you recommended.
I think that's a safe bet. I think one thing you have to consider as a beginning player is that the hand does not end pre-flop. You're going to have to navigate the flop, the turn, and the river. And so what Wayne is saying basically is that because we should expect that a beginning player is going to make a fair amount of mistakes on future streets, it's probably safer to approach that by playing a range that's harder to make mistakes with. So you're counteracting your disadvantage on future streets by playing a range that's harder to misplay originally pre-flop. I think it's a good adjustment.
Yeah, I think as players start out, most of the bigger mistakes that newer players make is that they play too loose and they end up in spots where they don't know how to play their hand. So
let's talk about that specifically from the blinds, because we've talked about the gradient from early position to the button. Why is it a big mistake to play wide from the blinds? I want to hear it from you, and then I'm going to talk about what I see even with advanced players, because this is a big leak spot.
Well, it's kind of difficult for me to explain why if you're not going to go too deep into the details.
Simplest detail, Wayne.
Yeah. I would say that mainly it's because when you act first, you like we mentioned earlier, you have a positional disadvantage. It's kind of like going back to the analogy. It's like if you are fighting the war going uphill, it's our opponent can see more of what's going on, and we can't see what our opponent can see where we are, but we can't really see where they're at. And it's a very real example when it comes to poker as well. We act first, our opponents can see what we do, and then if we check, and then they get to see that we checked. But if they check, we don't get a chance to attack on their check.
Yep.
So I think what ends up happening is that the most simple way I would say this without explaining all of the details, is that our expected value is just lower when we're out of position in the long term. And because of that, we have to play tighter.
I would add only that the expected value is lower because the out of position player does not have as many opportunities available to him.
That's right.
As the in position player. I think that's a big thing. Okay, so we have this problem where a lot of players end up playing too wide from the blinds. Now remember, the blinds are the positions that have a forced amount of money that they have to post before the hands are dealt. So they already have money invested, which is probably the reason that a lot of players end up playing too wide. They want to protect their investment. The problem, like Wayne said, is that they don't have enough opportunities to maneuver post-flop, so they try to defend their investment pre-flop, but they end up just bleeding money away. It's a huge problem. We see it happening even at the more advanced levels where anytime a new student comes, it's one of the first filters that we run. Are you folding away too much money from the blinds by trying to defend too much pre-flop and then making mistakes post-flop? That's usually how it happens. Or they could just be calling too much pre-flop and then calling down too much post-flop with too weak of a range. It can happen in one of two ways. Both are bad. And the quick fix to both of them is to play a tighter pre-flop range on the blinds. So I would say this is the mature adjustment for any new player, is to acknowledge the fact that you're just going to have to play tighter pre-flop to avoid the most common mistakes.
Yeah, it's like, I think as a newer player, you got to understand that firstly, when we play poker, we want to make money. So we want to choose a strategy that's easy to make money. If we choose a strategy that's difficult to implement, it might be better in the long run, but if you don't start making money when you first play poker, you'll probably find that you don't really enjoy the game that much. So like, our job here is to give you the easy ways to start making money right away.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And so let's dive deeper into specific ranges that we will use in the various positions. So, and we're going to provide this in the chart, so you actually get to follow and you get to look at the chart. But I would say that coming back to the button, which is assuming everybody folds to us or it's a 3-player game, I would run about play 35% here.
It's pretty tight, Wayne. If I'm going to work with that, I would recommend something like I'm going to go around the wheel, early, middle, cutoff, button. So, okay, I'll go backwards because you said 35 from the button. So on the button, I'd play 35. From the cutoff, I'd play more like 20 to 25. From middle position, more like 15 to 20. And from early position, more like 10 to 15. Those are the percentiles that I feel like are relatively safe. And one way we could put it is playing those ranges will give you enough equity post-flop to be able to maneuver safely in general, which will translate into higher EV for your strategy.
Yeah, so what I would say is that in regards to the ranges that you recommended, let's just go with the tighter end of the spectrum, because I'm imagining that, like, hey, if I get my girlfriend to learn how to play poker right now and she goes to the casino, I'll tell her to play as tight as possible, or like as tight as is good, because if you haven't spent a lot of time playing poker and understanding post-flop concepts, just playing tighter is the best. Like,
for sure,
it's the easiest. So let's go with 35 on the button, 20 on the cutoff, 15 in middle position, and 10 in early position. I think it's very easy to remember as well. So yeah, we will give you all the charts so that you can follow these charts. And when you actually, so what happens is that we have 4 categories, right? Button, cutoff, middle position, which let's define it a little bit more. So if it's a 10-handed game, there are first that you get the button. So you get 2 blinds and you get 8 players. There's the button, which plays 35%, the cutoff, which plays 20%, and then there's another 6 positions. So the 3 middle positions, you play 15%, and the 3 earliest positions, you play 10%. So this is when nobody has acted before you. So now, given that we have given you the information, now you probably are thinking in your head, like, oh, what happens if somebody limps before me or somebody raises before me? What do I do now? So my simplest explanation to that is that if it's folded to you and you're playing 35% or 20% in that particular position, if there's action before you, you cannot play any looser than this. So that's the kind of the premise that I'm throwing in here.
I think that's a good premise. And usually you'll play tighter than it.
Yeah.
In general, I would say you'll play tighter with a raise in front of you than you would if you were the first to raise in. But I think that's a good metric for this lesson because we're keeping it more general.
Yeah.
So why don't you go into a little bit more what you just mentioned about limping? Because I think that's super relevant for this positional conversation. So a player has two options when he comes into the pot. He can limp, or which means he calls, basically. He calls the amount of the blind, or he can put a raise in. A lot of recreational players like to limp. Wayne, explain why that's not advised.
Okay, so basically it's the natural instinct for a newer player to limp because that's the cheapest way they can go into the pot and they want to see the flop. They want to see more cards, right? So I guess it is a lot of people's natural tendency to want to pay that one big blind because that's the cheapest way to see the pot. But if we actually think more about poker, the objective is not to see the flop. The objective is to win money. So
Nice.
I would actually think that raising instead of limping is a much better way to actually win money in poker. And the reasons for that is that it's very similar to the previous explanation that we made about playing out of position in the blinds. When we limp, there's a very good chance that we'll end up playing the hand out of position. The reason for that is that if we limp, especially we are early or mid position, the late positions, they can play quite a looser range than us. So it's very likely, given that there are so many players behind us, that somebody is going to come into the pot. And now we are forced to navigate a situation where we are going to be either out of position post-flop in a heads-up pot, or we're going to be playing in a multi-way pot. And
with a pretty wide range.
Yeah. The wide range part, it really depends on how if you actually limp a wide range as well. So, I mean, there are two ways to go about it, right? You can limp a very tight range that we recommended to you to raise, or you can limp like what most players just get into the game. Like they see two cards that are, I guess, connected or suited, and they just limp those hands.
That would be the limping strategy that we're not advising, is the very wide limping strategy. And I think the best point that you made, the one that resonates with me the most at least, is players think it's a cheap way to come into the pot. But that's a very one-dimensional view of the game. We're trying to win the most pots, and if we're putting ourselves out of position with a really hard situation to navigate over the next three streets, that's really what the problem is that you're not going to get to the river and be able to win the pot often enough because it's too hard to navigate from that type of positional disadvantage. So it's the difference between seeing the game as pre-flop, flop, turn, river in its entirety and just seeing the game as, I want to play for cheap pre-flop. They're two different paradigms.
Yeah. So the analogy I would give here is, I mean, I don't even really play chess, but this is how I imagine chess to be. We have it's easier to learn chess if you start off with a very fixed strategy of always doing the same kind of things. Because when we actually do that, then we can memorize all of the possible options on the later part of the game. In poker, it will be post-flop. Because if we limp and we raise sometimes, it makes the game tree very complicated. But if we just simply raise and push and make a game where there are less players that see the flop, we force the game into a part of the game that we are familiar with and that is easy to play, that we can optimize for more easily.
This isn't just for beginners, that advice either. Like, you see this happening. Okay, when you get good, when you actually start to understand how complex the different game tree options are, the thing that becomes very important to you is, how can I funnel the opponent into the specific parts of the game tree that I know best? So this is something that no matter how good you get, you're always sort of considering is, well, I would always rather play in the lines that I know how to play better. That never really stops. Nobody's so good at the game that they just like have every single branch of the game tree mapped out. It's far too complex. So yeah, I would say that's a huge upside to strategy development, is to really put an emphasis on condensing the game tree so that it's manageable.
Yeah. So like just imagine if you were to go to school and take an exam and there are 4 subjects, and now you could choose which subject to take in the exams. You're going to choose the one that you know the best. And poker is kind of like that. If you can go to school and choose the subject that you do the best and you're the best at all the time, of course you're going to make more money in the long run. So that's how we describe this process of funneling people into the game tree that you're most familiar with and that you're best at. And it's the one that you're just naturally incentivized to play anyway.
And you have control over it. That's the beautiful part about it. There are actions you can take that dictate where the hand will go. And so I like that there's a certain amount of free will around your strategy. In chess, something that used to happen, because I used to play, you would see, this is a different version of it, but what would happen, because I was young, I would go to these tournaments where the men would play very fast. And because they were playing fast, they would convince me that I should play fast. And then I would make mistakes. So it's like, that's another version of how someone can dictate the tempo of the game to funnel you into a place where you're not comfortable. That's a timing way to do it. There's strategy ways to do it too. And I think it's all extremely relevant to think about from a strategy development standpoint.
Yeah, so given that right now we are certain that we want to funnel them into a part of the game tree that we are more familiar with, which involves raising more often. So for example, if we are on the button and we are originally playing 35%, if somebody limps, we probably choose to play tighter than the 35% because there's more people left to act. So maybe we play the 20% range, or we play somewhere in between these 2 ranges. And you can see that this 20 and 35% range are all parts of a spectrum. You can choose what hand to eliminate and what hands to add. And you will see the charts later. Maybe that was not a good example. The example that I would give is that if somebody limps early position and we are in middle position, what do we do now? We have the options, firstly, of also limping, or we can raise. And I'm recommending to you that you raise hands in this spot and just pull everything else. So my personal recommendation here is that we just play 1 tier tighter than what we recommended you previously. So if you are in middle position, which you are supposed to play 15%, but there's 1 limper in early position, you could just play 10%. I mean, you could even just play the 15% as well. Just probably doesn't matter.
But really never limp.
Yeah, that's the important point, exactly.
Because it's only going to make things more complicated by expanding the amount of situations you're going to have to navigate. And on average, it's going to give you worse options for navigation. Like, there is something to be said about taking the initiative in the hand. And there's some controversy over that at high level theory, but it really does make a lot of sense from a simplistic framework. Giving yourself the chance to narrow the game tree by taking aggressive actions simplifies things and gives you a better outlet for navigation in general.
Yeah, this would be a game changer for your game if you start playing the game more aggressively and funneling people into your game tree. If you actually execute on this, you almost definitely start winning at the lowest levels at a 50-cent $1 game in poker right away.
You'll almost definitely beat everybody else who's limping.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's very true.
I mean, think about how much harder poker would get if you took all of the bad players out of the pool who insist on limping. If all those players started raising, poker would get quite a bit harder very quickly. So I like what we've done in terms of outlining what I think are the biggest aspects of playability and highlighting the biggest mistake, which is probably limping. I can't think of a bigger mistake than that, except for playing very wide from the blinds by calling raises. Those 2 kind of go hand in hand. But yeah, I think that's a good summary of the pre-flop playability, and I think that we should get them charts too. Anything else that you're wanting to add to this to prepare them for the next lesson?
Well, I would say that there are two more things we need to touch on before we wrap up. The first of which is, some of you might be thinking, hey, you're talking about what happens if they limp, how do I play then? But what if they raise before me? Or if they limp, what sizing should I be raising them to? Or like how big should I be raising? So that's the first part, like how to actually have more executable insights for how to play the game pre-flop. And the second one is that we actually didn't cover what kind of ranges to use in the blinds. So let's, I'll go first, and you can chime in after. I would say that if somebody is limping, the very general strategy that works is that, and this is the assumption that I'm going to leave you with an assumption, and let me know what you think about this, Nick, is that when you are a beginner in poker, you want to see the flop heads up. You want two people to be in the flop because that is an easy way for you to understand. It's a lot easier to play post-flop in a 2-player game than in a 3 or 4-player game. So assuming that we want to isolate people and play heads up in a pot against others, if we are raising 3 big blinds pre-flop as our initial strategy that we are recommending, right now if there's a limper, I would increase that by 1 big blind to 4 big blinds per limper. So if there are 2 limpers, I'll make it 5 big blinds. If there are 3 limpers, I'll make it 6 big blinds.
I like this in terms of a heuristic, and I think it goes back to making sure that you choose strategy options that condense the game tree. So for instance, like part of it being good to get heads up goes back to the same reasons why it's good to raise 3x instead of limp. The goal is basically to simplify the hand while playing ranges that are strong enough to navigate post flop. Those are the two major things. We want to have good vision with good equity when we take a hand post flop. And in order to have good vision, we either have to be in some combination of in position or heads up with a few players in the pot. So in terms of blinds and playing from the blinds, I think me and Wayne are both in agreement that tighter is better, especially for new players. When in doubt, veer on the tight side. Again, you're dealing with mostly the positional disadvantage that you'll have to face over multiple streets, which we're trying to account for by getting you to play a tighter than normal range so that you can expect fewer confusing spots post flop so you don't compound errors, because it is a 4-street game. It's 4, right, Wayne?
Yeah, the last I checked is 4. But sometimes I make it 6.
So with the blinds, I mean, the general guidelines for how many hands you can play change depending on what position is opening. I think it's best to leave that for some charts. It functions on a similar gradient as the other positions that we talked about, though, where you'll obviously be getting tighter the earlier the raiser position is, because the tighter your opponent's range is, generally the tighter your range has to be. So that would be the general cliffs on blind play. And I like how you mentioned that our standard raise sizing is usually 3x from all positions. I think that's a pretty safe way to standardize.
Yeah, I'd say that if we categorize, like if somebody raises and we are in the blinds and we want to choose how wide to play, I'll just simplify it in a way that is like, if our opponent is raising first in cutoff or button, so they're playing 35 or 20%, we can, in the blinds, play 20%. If they are playing from middle position and they are playing, so if they're playing in the 3 middle positions, we play 15%. If they're playing from early position, we play 10%. That way, you don't have to remember so many charts, and it's kind of easy. You just need to remember 4 charts, and you can use that for almost all situations.
I like that as an intro pack, because if you're trying to squeeze every piece of expected value out of your range when you're not already well versed in how to navigate the post flop tree, you're going to run into problems. So it's better that you just accept, I'm new, I'm going to play tighter ranges, and they're going to still win because I'm going to play them soundly post-flop. Your goal as a beginner is to beat the players at the table that are worse than you. You've got to accept that. And you're protecting yourself against the players that are better than you.
Yeah, I'd like to add that the reason you want to pass on the very close spots where you could be making money or you could be losing money is because those spots are difficult to navigate. And as somebody that's just starting to learn how to play poker, we have two options. The first option is to spend time working on spots that we know we will win for sure and win more in those spots. Or the second is to work on the very complicated matter of trying to carve out a very small win rate in very close spots. And it's pretty obvious to me that working on the spots where you can definitely generate more money and study poker in those situations instead of the difficult situations.
There's a term that we use for that. It's a scientific term, and it's something that we use at all levels of training. We call it impact factor. When you're trying to assess whether or not you should bother studying a spot or trying to play more hands in a certain spot, you look at the impact factor of it. It's a scientific term. It basically tries to assess how much is the spot worth in general. How much room is there for improvement in this spot? Does it happen frequently enough for me to study? Is the edge available big enough for me to care about? So based on those factors, you come up with whether or not something is high impact or low impact. You want to put your focus on high impact zones.
Yeah, exactly. I like that summary of it. So to wrap up, let's cover the last point, which is, so now if somebody raises before us and we are in position, what do we do? I'd say that this is a situation where it's significantly harder to simplify because we have the option of folding as usual, we have the option of calling, and we have the option of re-raising, which is called a 3-bet. And how deep do you want to go with this explanation, Nick?
I think we can keep it safe by saying that a good player mixes all three options, and the frequency at which he will mix depends on either his reads on his opponent or how perfectly he's trying to play. But in general, if you want to get better, it will become necessary to mix all three of those options. Sounds scary at first, but you can develop a pretty good grasp over how each of those strategy options navigate throughout the game tree. The problem with only playing one response, like if you were someone who only defended by calling a raise or only defended by raising, is that it creates too big of an imbalance in your strategy. You don't have enough, maybe I wouldn't put it that way, but there are certain hands that prefer to raise and prefer to call, and there is a need to balance both lines from a standpoint of generating the highest EV. So forgetting to do that has consequences. Though to simplify it, maybe I wouldn't have a player 3-betting very aggressively except for the best hands right off the bat. Maybe he can just 3-bet a very, very tight range of very strong hands. And that might be good enough just to start. But I think it's safe to say that this is going to be a progression where you expand your strategy towards something more complex. And our goal is basically to give you something simple that wins and that's easy for you to execute and practice.
Yeah, so probably what it would look like at first is that you 3-bet or you re-raise pocket aces and pocket kings, and maybe just start there. And then if we are allowed to play 15% in that situation, how do I explain this? For example, if we think that if we see our opponent raising from a position that we think that in that position we would have played 15% ourselves, and we think that he's playing about 15%, the maximum that we can possibly play in that spot is around 15%. We shouldn't it's not gonna generate any EV playing any wider than that. So if we are playing a 15% in that spot, maybe just 3-bet aces and kings, and then call like top 10% or top 15%. I feel like I'm trying to I'm trying to simplify this spot so much that it might lose some of its message.
I think it's a fair assessment, though. Don't play wider than the initial opener range. Play a very tight 3-bet range of very strong hands only, and fill the calling range out with hands that aren't as strong but really want to see a flop. They really want to see 3 cards and try to make a hand. And then you'll have if you're on the button when you're calling, you'll have your positional playability to work with post flop, which we'll get into in a future lesson. But it does matter. It matters quite a lot to have that higher ground advantage of being in position.
All right. Yeah, sounds good. I think we wrapped up what we'd like to cover for this episode. So right now I'm thinking that next episode we gotta cover some basic post flop play. So mainly on the flop and a little bit, I guess, turn river. What do you say?
Yeah, we could take it as it comes, and I think what will happen is we'll start at the flop, we'll do some turn river, and we'll keep coming back to the flop to tie up loose ends.
Yeah, sounds perfect. All right, it was a fun session, Nick. See you next time. Bye.
Thanks, guys. See ya.